Now, I mentioned there about a third book that we're planning in our head at the moment that'll be out in about November. And it's going to be something, it's going to be a wee bit going back for me to stuff I was involved in back between 1999 and 2013, which was looking at the monetary system and how debt was exploding and how house prices were getting out of everybody's reach and why that was. And a lot of it is, of course, due to the way that money is created. And this is something that people never, that's really, I don't want to sound esoteric, but it is a sort of hidden, it is a hidden knowledge. And is deliberately hidden because the reality makes some people a great deal of money. And I was thinking about that the other day, and I realized that tomorrow, 7th of August, is the 111th anniversary of something called the Bradbury Pound. Now, on the 4th of August 1914, World War was announced, at least Britain's war with Germany was announced. And what happened in the next 2 days was that there was a run on the banks. Everybody, or not everybody, but anybody with substantial money wanted to get their money out the banks because they were concerned that the banks were going to fail, and they wanted gold. Now, of course, the gold's not there to give people. So the government were faced with a crisis, and what could they do? And so the Secretary of the Treasury, a chap called James Bradbury, came up with the idea that what we'll simply do is give them paper. And it was called the Bradbury Pound. And let's have a look there. It goes, "These notes are a legal tender for a payment of any amount, issued by the Lords Commissioners of His Majesty's Treasury under authority of Act of Parliament." And it's signed there by John Bradbury, Secretary of the Treasury. And that's on the left there, there's a little emblazoned pic of the king at the time, which was George V. Okay. So how does the government of the day explain that? I found this explanation from the British Treasury today. Let's bring up that pic there. Freedom of Information Act, the Bradbury Pound. The Bradbury Pound was introduced in 1914 at the outbreak of the First World War. The government at the time needed to preserve its stock of bullion, so asked the Bank of England to cease paying out gold for its notes. Instead, the Treasury printed and issued 10 shilling and £1 notes, so-called Bradbury Pounds. The gold standard was then partially restored in 1925, and the Bank of England was again obliged to exchange its notes for gold, but only in multiples of 400 ounces or more. Britain left the gold standard in 1931, and the note issue became entirely fiduciary, that is, wholly backed by securities instead of gold. Okay, what they mean there by fiduciary is basically backed by other pieces of paper. Because what happens today is if the government wants money, it prints what it calls securities, which are promises to pay the buyer whatever is denominated on that particular security, plus interest sometime in the future. So if the government wants to raise £1 million, it sells 1 million securities, it gets the £1 million in, but it's then indebted to give that £1 million back at some time in the future to the purchasers of these securities, plus interest. And that interest is what's called the national debt. And we actually talk about this in a chapter here. We've got a whole chapter on the markets and why the markets panic when they hear about immigration policies that they don't like. They panic. And why do they panic, and so on and so forth. And it's a very good explanation in that book. But I want to flesh that out in another document. And I want to just before we bring on our guest in 2 or 3 minutes, I just want to say that the Bradbury Pound was actually a very good idea because it was not backed by debt. It was simply government created money. The government didn't create the Bradbury Pounds by selling Bradbury securities to anybody. It just said we need £100 million or whatever the figure was. We need to get that into society because people are asking for their money. So they just printed the money debt free. There was nobody that it had to be there was nobody that was purchasing the securities. It was just government created, or what I like to call publicly created, debt free money, which by its very nature of being debt free was also interest free. And that completely undermined the financiers and the financial system, because the financial system is built upon the whole idea that they lend to the government and the government gives them money in return with interest. So the Bradbury Pound is a good idea, but the City of London basically put the kibosh on it and stopped that privately created debt-free money from being rolled out, as it were, in the years to come. But it's an answer to Britain's great level of indebtedness, because it's the financial system to whom we owe the debt. And for many of us, it's becoming intolerable.